Yeah.
Namaskar. So in this session, we will review a book by Professor Max Muller. Professor Max Muller was born in Germany, but at the age of 23, he shifted to England. And thereafter, he remained in England until his death in the year 1900. He was born in 1823. He lived up to 1900. And the latter 54 years he spent at Oxford in England. He was a professor, I should say a professor of professors. He was a great scholar, and he has edited the most significant work of his is the Sacred Books of India. It is a 51 volume huge corpus of Sanskrit literature, especially the scriptures, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and related scriptures, which he edited during his lifetime, though there were many translators who worked under him. He was the chief editor and the tallest among them. He was born a Christian, and he was a great Christian enthusiast of Christianity, spreading Christianity in the world maybe, but in India for sure. In the early part of his life, you see this very strong impulse in him to spread Christianity in India. And in fact, his work, the examination of the Vedas and exposing it to the world, not only to the Western world through English, but also to the Indian intellectuals, Indian middle class intellectuals, was partly motivated by his interest in spreading Christianity in India. But at some point of time, that is at the later part of his life, he became a convert. Not convert in the normal sense of the word of a Shuddhi or anything, but then he began to see India as a very valuable mine of knowledge and a great culture. And the content of this book, which you have picked, What Can India Teach Us, is actually a set of lectures which he gave in 1882 at the Cambridge University for the ICS trainees, the Indian Civil Service trainees. This book contains 7 chapters, that means 7 lectures. The ICS people, of course, they had a definite syllabus, but somehow somebody thought of those ICS trainees to be exposed to Professor Max Muller, who was a most renowned Indian scholar, or rather scholar of India. But Professor Max Muller gave a very positive indication, very positive approach or highly respectful approach towards India. And it is contained in these 7 lectures, which runs into several hundred pages. There are 7 chapters I mentioned, but I would not be reviewing all the 7 chapters. But my particular interest is on the 2nd chapter. It is on the truthful character of the Hindus. It's titled as Truthful Character of the Hindus, where Professor Max Muller observes that through the ages, the Hindus have displayed a great affinity towards a value called truthfulness, and also the value called justice, truth and justice. So he's a scholar of scholars, so he goes to meticulous depth, gives lot of quotations, authenticates his statement, and gives it in a plate, a truthful character of Hindus. The other chapters may not be suitable for presentation as such, but then I thought that this chapter really indicates what India can teach the world. That's the subject of today's presentation. I mentioned he was born a Christian in Germany, and at the age of 23, he shifted to Oxford, England, where he became a professor. Initially a deputy professor, maybe today we call it as assistant professor, deputy professor of modern languages in 1850. And later on, he became a full professor of comparative philology, it is called, essentially a professor of Sanskrit in 1868 at the Oxford University. But 7 years later, he retired from that post, but he devoted his time for the work he had started, that is editing of the sacred books of the East. His work are essentially, can be classified into three: Rigveda Samhita, the sacred hymns of the Brahmanas, 6 volumes, that is from 49 to 74, roughly 25 years. The sacred books of the East, a 51-volume series of translations, and then the sacred books of the Buddhists. Under 3 heads, he must have edited something like 60, 70 books. His initial impulse about Christianity and about India are available for us in a few letters which he wrote to his friends, to his wife, to his mother, and also to the officials in the British government. The first of them is dated 1856. There are other letters, but I have quoted what is relevant for this purpose. 1856, the next letter which I have quoted from 67, and another from 1868. This letter was written to his friend Chevalier Bunsen. Here he expounds his purpose. He says, India is much riper for Christianity than Rome or Greece were at the time of St. Paul. Study the history of Christianity. You find St. Paul moved from Jerusalem to Rome with a mission to spread Christianity. And initially, Rome's response was very negative. But over 200-300 years, the persistence of Christian missionaries prevailed on Rome, and finally Rome accepted Christianity. In fact, its emperor accepted Christianity, Constantine, in 312. He became emperor in 312. Sometime later, he got converted into Christianity, I think 320s or so. After that, it was very easy for them. That's how Christianity established its organization, the center of its organization, as a Roman Catholic Church in Rome. So here he says, India is much riper for Christianity than Rome or Greece were at the time of St. Paul. The rotten tree has for some time had artificial supports because its fall would have been inconvenient for the government. In fact, Christianity was being spread in India starting from Goa, where the Portuguese had a colony, And they started this work very aggressively in 1510 onwards, very aggressively. But the British rulers, the East India Company was much more careful. It did not make its support to Christianity very obvious. Its mission was not primarily for spreading religion, but primarily for spreading business. Whereas the Portuguese had a primary purpose of spreading their Christianity right from day one. Whereas the Britain took this stand as a matter of strategy, as a prop for its own empire, only in 1813 onwards. So he says that in India it has not spread so much, or the Hinduism, the tree of Hinduism has not fallen because it was not very convenient for the British, the East India Company, to support that, and that's how the rotten tree has not yet fallen. But if the Englishman comes to see that the tree must fall sooner or later, then the thing is done. I should like to lay down my life, or at least to lend my hand to bring about this struggle. I should like to live for 10 years quite quietly and learn the language, that is Sanskrit, try to make friends, and see the way opened for the entrance of simple Christian teaching. This is the mission of many of the European scholars in the 19th century. In 1867, Max Muller wrote to his wife, "I feel convinced," he said, "though I shall not live to see it, that this edition of mine, that is the sacred books of the East, and the translation of the Veda, will hereafter tell to a great extent on the fate of India and on the growth of millions of souls in that country. It is the root of their religion, and to show them what the root is, I feel sure, is the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it during the last 3,000 years. One ought to be up and doing what may be God's work." See, that his inspiration is that it is God's work. Translation of Vedas for a different purpose, to uproot the Indian culture and install there Christianity. This is in 1868. He wrote to the Secretary of State of India in the British government, the Duke of Argyll, saying that you need to work more, you need to support more. India has been conquered once, but India must be conquered again. Once politically, second through education. India must be conquered again, and that second conquest should be a conquest by education. Much has been done for education of late, but if the funds were tripled and quadrupled, that would hardly be enough. A new national literature may spring up, impregnated with Western ideas, yet retaining its native spirit and character. A new national literature will bring with it a new national life and a new moral vigor. As to religion, that will take care of itself. The missionaries have done far more than they themselves seem to be aware of. The ancient religion of India is doomed, and if Christianity does not step in, whose fault will it be? Look what is he saying. He is saying through education you have to prepare the mind of India for Christianity. Max Muller's greatest contribution or most notable contribution is the Aryan invasion theory. He propounded it in the 1850s and continued to do it for the next 30 years. But by around 1882, he realized his folly and he admitted that, and I'll show you how he admitted. But his initial theory was this, that around 1500 BC, hordes of semi-barbarian, Sanskrit-speaking pastoral nomads, the fair-skinned Aryans, poured into northwest of India from some location in Central Asia or Europe. There is no basis for this proposition except that it is a conjecture. It must have been before Christ. It must have been not far too in the antiquity, not very far away in the antiquity, but around 1500 BC. This is the conjecture of Max Muller. 1500 BC, people entered the northwest India from Europe or Asia, Central Asia, Central Europe. From where exactly from, nobody knows. Even today, nobody knows. Even today, there are 23 different locations are identified, not really identified, proposed to have been the place from where Aryans migrated. They fought with the local original inhabitants of the land, the dark-skinned Dravidians, and drove them southwards. This also doesn't have any historical support. The people in the south are dark-skinned. So Max Muller's conjecture is that Aryans entered from the north. The dark-skinned Dravidians were in the north at that time, but Aryans fought with them and drove them southwards. And the fight is being represented as the Ramayana and Mahabharata are supposed to be the fight between the Aryans and Dravidians. The Aryans settled in the land of 7 rivers, where they composed the Vedas and Puranas and epics. So Max Muller gives a time frame for all this. He says from 1000 to 800 it is this, from 800 to 600 it is this, 600 BC I'm referring to, from 600 to 400 it is this. Like that, he allocates time for that. Again, quite arbitrary. The Ramayana and Mahabharata are a poetic record of conflicts between the invading Aryans and the local Dravidians. This is, in a sense, the Aryan invasion theory. But subsequently, over a period of time, as he started studying the scriptures of India, it rubbed him on the right, and he changed several of his viewpoints, though might have not entirely abandoned the invasion theory. He developed a tremendous respect for India, and in this set of lectures, he has said this. This is in the Cambridge University, 1882. In the very first chapter, he mentions this. Read this, how much he has changed, how much he was transformed. In 82, he says, if I were to look over the whole world to find out the country most richly endowed with all the wealth, power, and beauty that nature can bestow, in some parts a very paradise on earth, I should point to India. Continues, if I were asked under what sky the human mind has most fully developed some of its choicest gifts, has most deeply pondered on the greatest problems of life and has found solutions to some of them, which well deserve the attention even of those who have studied Plato and Kant. I should point to India. Plato is an ancient Greek philosopher. Kant, the German philosopher of modern times. He continued, and if I were to ask myself from what literature we here in Europe, we who have been nurtured almost exclusively on the thoughts of Greeks and Romans, and one Semitic race, the Jewish, may draw that corrective, please mark the words, draw that corrective which is most wanted to make our inner life more perfect, more comprehensive, more universal, in fact, more truly human, a life not for this life only, but a transfigured and eternal life. Again, I should point to India. This is what Professor Max Muller told the ICS trainees in 1882. His approach to the scriptures is this: there is no book in the world that is so thrilling, stirring, and inspiring as the Upanishads. That was in 1882. And in 1896, almost at the latter fag end of his life, Swami Vivekananda met Professor Max Muller at Oxford. In fact, Swami Vivekananda has a very high opinion of Professor Max Muller, which he has written, and it was published in 1896. Yeah. This is what Swamiji wrote about the professor. The visit was really a revelation to me. That nice little house in its setting of a beautiful garden, the silver-headed sage with a face calm and benign and a forehead smooth as a child's in spite of 70 winters, and every line in that face speaking of a deep-seated mine of spirituality somewhere behind. That noble wife, the helpmate of his life, through his long and arduous task of exciting interest, overriding opposition and contempt, and at last creating a respect for the thoughts of the sages of ancient India. The trees, the flowers, the calmness, and the clear sky, all these sent me back in imagination to the glorious days of ancient India, the days of our Brahmarshis and Rajarshis, the days of the great Vanaprasthas, the days of Arundhatis and Vasishthas. That is a tribute by Swamiji. Regarding the Aryan invasion theory, Max Muller finally said this, wrote this: I have declared again and again that if I say Aryas, I mean neither blood nor bones, nor hair nor skull. Okay, the Aryan invasion theory makes Arya a race, conceives Arya as a race. Whereas the Indian perspective is that Arya means a cultured individual. Now here, Max Muller abandons his theory and accepts the definition of India, by India. I mean neither blood nor bones, nor hair nor skull. I mean simply those who speak Aryan language. When I speak of them, I commit to no anatomical characteristics. The blue-eyed and fair-haired Scandinavians may have been conquerors or conquered. They may have adopted the language of their darker lords or their subjects, or vice versa. I assert nothing beyond their language when I call them Hindus, Greeks, Romans, Germans, Celts, and Slavs. And in that sense, and in that sense only, to me, an ethnologist who speaks of Aryan race, Aryan blood, Aryan eyes and hair is a great sinner. Is as great a sinner as a linguist who speaks of these tongue-twisting words. It is about it is about Dolly, whatever it is. It is about the structure of one's head. Okay. So Max Muller has recanted from his earlier stand that Aryan was a race. But by the time he mentioned this, the theory had gone out of his hand, like an arrow kicking off from the bow. It is no more under his control. It was no more under his control. It became a weapon in the hands of the British administrators, and the Aryan invasion theory propounded by Max Muller became a subject of the textbooks in England as well as in India, and which remained there for the next century or so. Even today, it is there in our textbooks. Let me look at the second lecture which he gave, the truthful character of the Hindus. Look at what this says. Max Muller, it is surely extremely strange that whenever, either in Greek or in Chinese, or in Persian or in Arab writings, that is, several visitors, travelers, invaders came to India, and whatever they have observed when they have documented, from the time of Alexander and much later, he says, we meet with any attempts at describing the distinguishing features of the national character of Indians, regard for truth and justice should always be mentioned first. Having said this, Professor Max Muller supports his argument, supports his thesis. He talks about Megasthenes. Megasthenes was the ambassador of Seleucus Nicator. Seleucus Nicator was the subaltern of Alexander. After Alexander withdrew, some portion of the northwest where his subordinate, his subaltern was ruling, that was Seleucus Nicator. His ambassador to the court of Sandracotas in Polybotra, interpreted as Chandragupta of Pataliputra, states that thefts were extremely rare in Magadh, in Polybotra, or purported to be Pataliputra, and that they honored truth and virtue. The exact words are, translated words are, all Indians, these are Megasthenes, all Indians are free and none of them is a slave. Because slavery was quite common in Europe at that time, in the Middle East at that time, in Greece, it was quite common. Slaves were sold and purchased. But in India, there was no slavery, he says. All Indians are free and none of them is a slave. Indians neither invade other peoples, nor do other peoples invade India. They are not led to invade. They fare happily because of their simplicity and their frugality. Since they esteem beauty, they practice everything that can beautify their appearance. Further, they respect alike virtue and truth. In the 2nd century, Arian, 2nd century Christian era, that's around 500 years after Megasthenes, when speaking of the public overseers or superintendents in India, he says, they oversee what goes on in the country or towns and report everything to the king, where the people have a king, and to the magistrates where the people are self-governed. Please notice that he is referring to self-governance, which is in a form of democratic government. They are called republics. And it is against use and want for these to give in a false report. But indeed, no Indian is accused of lying. Very sweeping statement, but the spirit behind that. No Indian is accused of lying, he says. He greatly admires the fact that the Indians were very truthful. The Chinese report in the 3rd century of Christian era. The Chinese bear the same unanimous testimony in favor of the honesty and veracity of the Hindus. Veracity means truthfulness. The earliest witness is Su Vi between 222 and 227 AD, 3rd century, sailed round the whole of India till he reached the mouth of the Indus and then explored the country, starting from Sindh, and then reported back to his emperor in China in 231 AD. It is a kingdom in which the religion of Buddha flourishes. The inhabitants are straightforward and honest, and the soil is very fertile. The king is called Maulun, and his capital is surrounded by walls. The operating point is straightforward and honest. Xuanzang visited India during the time of Harshavardhana in Kanauj, that is 7th century. So he stayed in the court of Harshavardhana for several months and then was a witness to the festival which Harshavardhana used to celebrate of emptying his entire treasury by way of alms to the deserving over a period of a month. He would pitch his tent on the banks of Ganga and Jamuna and then call people and then distribute the riches of his treasury entirely until the treasury becomes empty. This he used to do once in 5 years. And Xuanzang was a witness to this. The most famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim who visited India in the 7th century wrote, though the Indians are of a light temperament, they are distinguished by the straightforwardness and honesty of their character. With regard to riches, they never take anything unjustly. With regard to justice, they make even excessive concessions. Straightforwardness is the distinguishing feature of their administration, not only in personal life, but also in administration. Another traveler in the 11th century, a Mohammedan, accounts given by the Mohammedan conquerors of India, we find Idrisi in his geography summing up their opinion of the Indians in the following words. The Indians are naturally inclined to justice and never depart from it in their actions. Their good faith, honesty, and fidelity to their engagements are well known. And they are so famous for these qualities that people flock to their country from every side. Andalusia in the 11th century. Andalusia came from Spain. Arab scholar Sayyid ibn Ahmad al-Andalusi, 11th century, wrote this. The Indians among all nations, through many centuries and since antiquity, have been the source of wisdom, fairness, and moderation. They are people of sublime thoughts, universal apologues, rare inventions, and remarkable concepts. It's paying tribute to the intellectual capacity, imagination of the Hindus. Shamsuddin Abu Abdullah, 13th century, writes this. The Indians are innumerable, like grains of sand, free from all deceit and violence. They fear neither death nor life. What a tribute. They fear neither death nor life. Free from deceit and violence. In the 13th century, Marco Polo came from somewhere in the Middle East, you can say. He took the Silk Route and came to India. So he writes, you must know, Marco Polo says, that these Abrahman, maybe he is referring to the Brahmin, are the best merchants in the world and the most truthful, for they would not tell a lie for anything on earth. In the 14th century, Friar Jordanus. In the 14th century, we have Friar Jordanus who goes out of his way to tell us that the people of Lesser India, probably meant South and Western India, are true in speech and eminent in justice. In the 15th century, Kamaluddin Samarkandi, who went as ambassador to the ambassador of the Khakan to the Prince of Calicut and to the King of Vijayanagara, bears testimony to the perfect security which merchants enjoy in that country. Thefts were very rare. It is said that they used to sleep with their doors open, etc. In the 16th century, Abu Fazl was a minister of Emperor Akbar who wrote Aini Akbari, that is the story of Akbar, in which he writes, the Hindus are religious, affable, cheerful, lovers of justice, given to retirement, able in business, admirers of truth, grateful and of unbounded fidelity. And their soldiers know not what it is to fly from the field of battle. Yeah, this is the same thing translated by somebody else. The inhabitants of this land are religious, affectionate, hospitable, genial, and frank. They are fond of scientific pursuits, inclined to austerity of life, seekers of justice, contented, industrious, capable in affairs, loyal, truthful, and constant. They, one and all, believe in the unity of God, and as to the reverence they pay to the images of stone and wood and the like, which simpletons regard as idolatry, it is not so. This is a comment of Abul Fazl. And from a distant land, from France, Voltaire was the French intellectual in the era prior to the French Revolution. French Revolution was 1789. Wrote Voltaire, we have shown how much we surpass the Indians in courage and wickedness. In courage as well as wickedness. How much we surpass the Indians in courage and wickedness, and how inferior to them we are in wisdom. Our European nations have mutually destroyed themselves in this land, where we only go in search of money, while the first Greek traveled to the same land only to instruct themselves. The Greek used to come to India for studies. Says Voltaire, I am convinced that everything has come down to us from the banks of the Ganges. Astronomy, astrology, metempsychosis, etc. Warren Hastings was the Governor General of East India Company, Governor General of India under East India Company. He ruled for about 12 years, 1773 to 1785. He speaks of the Hindus in general. He says, they are gentle and benevolent, more susceptible of gratitude for kindness shown to them, and less prompted to vengeance for wrongs inflicted than any people on the face of the earth. They are forgiving. It may be called a virtue, but it may also be taken as a weakness. Less prompted to vengeance for wrongs inflicted than any people on the face of the earth. Faithful, affectionate, submissive to legal authority. This is 1780s. Bishop Reginald Heber was an English bishop, man of letters and hymn writer. After 16 years as a country parson, he served as Bishop of Calcutta until his death at the age of 42. About India, he said, the Hindus are brave, courteous, intelligent, most eager for knowledge and improvement, sober, industrious, dutiful to parents, affectionate to their children, uniformly gentle and patient, and more easily affected by kindness and attention to their wants and feelings than any people I ever met with. This is Thomas Munro. Thomas Munro was the governor of Madras Presidency between 1819 to 27, 8 years. Thomas Munro was considered to be one of the gentlemen governors, very considerate to India. And it is the same gentleman who had the vision of Raghavendra Swami at Mantralaya, etc. He writes, this is a statement made before a parliamentary committee, an internal, confidential deposition before a Parliamentary Committee. He says, if a good system of agriculture, see this is coming from a governor, it's not the weightage we have to attach. It is not an ordinary traveler, but a governor who had a view and vision of the whole countryside. If a good system of agriculture, unrivaled manufacturing skill, a capacity to produce whatever can contribute to either convenience or luxury, schools established in every village for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, the general practice of hospitality and charity among each other, and above all, a treatment of the female sex full of confidence, respect, and delicacy are among the signs which denote a civilized people. Then the Hindus are not inferior to the nations of Europe. And if civilization is to become an article of trade between England and India, I am convinced that England will gain by the import cargo. What a tribute. In fact, this treatment of the female sex has been mentioned by Colonel Sleeman also. Colonel Sleeman was an administrator, a soldier, and a kind of a police officer who was in charge of recruiting spies for the East India Company. So he interacted intimately, and he says that it is very, very surprising the kind of treatment Indian people gave to the female sex, especially the British ladies. Mount Stuart Elphinstone was also a governor of Bombay at the same time as Munro was in Madras. He was a historian. He wrote the history of India. Elphinstone wrote the history of India after retirement. In 1841 or so it was published, in which he says, no set of people among the Hindus are so depraved as the dregs of our own great towns. He is comparing India to England. No set of people among Hindus are so depraved as the dregs of our own great towns. The villagers are everywhere amiable, affectionate to their families, kind to their neighbors, and toward all but government, honest and sincere. With regard to government, they were not. That is what he is saying. And he also gives the reasons for that. He says the government has been extremely harsh on the public, and they would try to escape your fangs naturally. And towards all but the government, honest and sincere, including the thugs and dacoits. Thugs is a sect of dacoits. Including the thugs and dacoits, the mass of crime is less in India than in England. The thugs are almost a separate nation, and the dacoits are desperate ruffians in gangs. The Hindus are mild and gentle people, more merciful to prisoners than any other Asiatics. He's talking about their kindness. Even to the culprits, convicts, they are kind, he says. Mild and gentle people, more merciful to prisoners than any other Asiatics. Their freedom from gross debauchery is the point in which they appear to most advantage compared to England. And their superiority in purity of manners is not flattering to our self-esteem. They are better than the English. That is a former governor. This is Colonel Sleeman. Colonel Sleeman later became Major General Sleeman, But when he wrote this book, the author's name was Colonel Sleeman. Major General William Sleeman was a British administrator, a soldier, officer who was well accomplished in Hindi and Urdu, involved in the recruitment of local informers for the British Raj, involved in the suppression of Thuggis. Thugs were a sect. In fact, Elphinstone calls them as a separate nation. It's a group, it's a sect of people who lived on dacoity in northern India. So the suppression of Thuggis was a program for the East India Company. So Colonel Sleeman was in charge of this task. And he wanted, when you say that you want to suppress a sect, he needed informers to report about their whereabouts, their movements, etc. So he mixed very freely with them, very intimately with the people, and he could speak the local language, Hindi, Awadhi, or Urdu, etc. Sleeman wrote intimately about the Indians from first-hand experience. His experience is documented in the book Ramblings and Recollections of an Indian Official, published in 1844, available for downloading in the internet, from the internet. This is what he says. In most villages, there is a sacred tree, a peepal tree, and the gods are supposed to delight to sit among its leaves and listen to the music of their rustling. The deponent, he's saying that the person who gives, he is cited as a witness in a court. A deponent takes one of these leaves in his hand and invokes the god who sits above him. Oh, crush him or those dear to him, as he crushes the leaf in his hand and he speaks. He says that if I tell a lie, you will crush me like I am crushing this leaf. And then he deposes. If he speaks anything but the truth, then he would be crushed by the god. That's what he's saying. He then plucks and crushes the leaf and states what he has to say. And this, he says, in their panchayats, that is Indian panchayats, men adhere habitually and religiously to the truth. If they come before the panchas and depose, it is truth only. Says Sleeman, I have had before me hundreds of cases in which a man's property, liberty, and life has depended upon his telling a lie, and he has refused to tell it. Look at this, he's talking in 1835-36, that period. The book was published in 44, but belonged to a period of about a decade earlier. And he's saying, in the panchayat, when a person deposes, you can take it that it is true. There are hundreds of cases, he says, in which a man's property, liberty, and life has depended upon his telling a lie, and he has refused to tell it. This is the loyalty to truth. I would also draw your attention to another point which Sleeman has recorded. This morality which the Indian citizens, Indian people have shown is essentially a religious morality. They involve the God and they are true to the God. But the consciousness regarding the political entity called a nation was very weak at that time. Look at this. Even between village and village, the usual restraints of public morality are not always recognized. They are true to their people, their villagers, yes, but not to the neighbors. What would be called theft or robbery at home is called a successful raid or conquest if directed against distant villages. And what would be falsehood or trickery in private life is honored by the name of policy and diplomacy if successful against strangers. That is, the entity is confined to the village, not to the neighboring village. I remember some time back in one of these sessions, Ravi had raised this question. Why is that when things were going wrong in Goa during the Portuguese occupation of Goa, during the, the holy office of Christianity, that is, tribunals were punishing people recklessly without reason, without justice, why is the rest of India did not react to it? It is the same thing. A village is an entity here, but the neighboring village is completely foreign to them. They do not have an identity. A pan-India identity had not developed. Sleeman assures us that the falsehood or lying between members of the same village is almost unknown. Speaking of some of the most savage tribes, the Gonds, for instance, he maintains that nothing would induce them to tell a lie, though they would think nothing of lifting a herd of cattle from a neighboring plain. This has led to a political weakness of India, which the British and other invaders were able to exploit. Now, Professor Max Muller, on his own experience, says this. During the last 20 years, however, I have had some excellent opportunities of watching a number of native scholars under circumstances where it is not difficult to detect a man's true character. Professor Max Muller never came to India, but in England, in Oxford, in Europe, he had opportunities to meet Indian scholars. He says it is not easy to detect the character of a man under normal circumstances, but under very special circumstances where there are controversies and people are involved in controversy and one-upmanship, it is easy to look at and judge their character, he says. I mean, in literary work and more particularly in literary controversy, I have watched them carrying on such controversies both among themselves and with certain European scholars. And I feel bound to say that, with hardly one exception, they have displayed a far greater respect for truth and a far more manly and generous spirit than we are accustomed to even in Europe and America. This is Professor Max Muller's own judgment. He continues, they have shown strength, the scholars, they have shown strength but no rudeness. Nay, I know that nothing has surprised them so much as the coarse invective to which certain Sanskrit scholars have condescended, Sanskrit scholars of Europe. Rudeness of speech being, according to their view of human nature, a safe sign not only of bad breeding but of want of knowledge. The decorum cannot be violated. When they were wrong, they have readily admitted their mistakes. When they were right, they have never sneered at their European adversaries. There has been, with few exceptions, no quibbling, no special pleading, no untruthfulness on their part. And certainly none of that low cunning of the scholar who writes down and publishes what he knows perfectly well to be false and snaps his fingers at those who still value truth and self-respect more highly than victory or applause at any price. Here too, we might possibly gain by the import cargo. Please note that he is quoting Thomas Munro, who said that if civilizations were the commodity of transfer, of trade between England and India, England would gain by the import cargo. Professor Max Muller says we might possibly gain by the import cargo. Concludes, let me add that I have been repeatedly told by English merchants that commercial honor stands higher in India than in any other country, and that dishonored bill is hardly known there. Somebody gives a word, somebody has given a note, they will honor it. This is 1882. But then the Indian society was no more the Indian society of the ancient times. All through centuries, we have seen how Indian society lived. But then there is a depravity, there is a decadence. A decadence that is a result of a foreign rule, says Max Muller. He says, as to modern times, and I date them from about 1000 after Christ. That is the time when Ghazni Muhammad invaded India, and post that period, post 1000 AD. I can only say that after reading the accounts of the terrors and horrors of Mohammedan rule, my wonder is that so much of native virtue and truthfulness should have survived. Still, you might as well expect a mouse to speak the truth before a cat as a Hindu before a Mohammedan judge. If you frighten a child, the child will tell a lie. If you terrorize millions, you must not be surprised if they try to escape from your fangs. It is the same thing among the British judge also. We have seen it in our last presentation, where Gandhiji himself was saying that 99 out of 100 cases, the British versus Indian citizen. If there is a contest, it would be a partial judgment. And India has suffered this for 1,000 years. If you terrorize millions, you must not be surprised if they try to escape from your fangs. Truthfulness is a luxury, perhaps the greatest, and let me assure you, the most expensive luxury in our life. And happy the man who has been able to enjoy it from his very childhood. He's talking about life in Indian society. And Elphinston, Mount Stuart Elphinston, historian, general governor of Mumbai, states that at present, want of veracity is one of their prominent vices, but he adds, he notices that want of veracity, that means truthfulness is one of their vices, he says. But then he says the reasons, that such a deceit is most common in people connected with government. A class which spreads far in India, as from the nature of the land revenue, the lowest villager is often obliged to resist force by fraud. Tax collection had exceeded 50% in India, which ruined the economy of the country for more than 1.5 centuries. Now Max Muller goes to the roots of this trait. Why is the Indian society valued truth and justice more than anything else. He says reverence to truth has been there in the very culture, in the very scripture, in the very literature of India. He says that is the cause the society has imbibed that, says Professor Max Muller. I have left to the last the witnesses who might otherwise have been suspected. I mean the Hindus themselves. The whole of their literature from one end to the other is pervaded by expressions of love and reverence for truth. Their very word for truth is full of meaning. It is Sat or Satya. Sat being the participle of the verb as to be. Sat means existence itself. Now, one of the highest praises bestowed upon the gods in the Veda is that they are Satya. They are true, truthful, trustworthy. And it is well known that both in modern and ancient times, men always ascribe to God or to their gods those qualities which they value most in themselves. He quotes, this is a quote from the book. A quote is from Chanakya Niti. Satyena dharyate prithvi, satyena tapate ravihi, satyena vayavo vanti, sarvam satye pratishthitam. The earth is based on Satya. Satyena dharyate. It is a truth that sustains the earth. The sun shines because of Satya. The wind blows because of Satya. Everything rests on Satya, it says. Sarvam Satye Pratishthitam. This is Chanakya Niti. And the opposite of Satya, Satyavak, is Drohavak. Somebody who cheats. The Drohavak, on the contrary, is used for deceitful men. Thus, Vasishtha, one of the great Vedic poets, says in the Rig Veda, if I had worshipped false gods, or if I believed in the gods vainly, but why art thou angry with us, O Jatavedas? May liars go to destruction. He says, Rig Veda talks about the Rita and Satya. Satya is Satya. Rita is something that governs the whole creation. The law that governs the whole creation. I will skip this. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is a commentary by Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya makes a commentary to Yajurveda in the Shatapatha Brahmana. Yajnavalkya is considered to be the most ancient of sages. He is considered by some as the father of Indian philosophy. Says Shatapatha Brahmana, whosoever speaks the truth makes the fire on his own altar blaze up, as if he poured butter into the lighted fire. His own light grows larger, and from tomorrow to tomorrow he becomes better. But whosoever speaks untruth, he quenches the fire on his altar, as if he poured water into the lighted fire. His own light grows smaller and smaller, and from tomorrow to tomorrow he becomes more wicked. Let man therefore speak truth only. See, this is the mandate, Atha Shasanam. This is the mandate from the Vedas. Atha Shasanam. In the Yajnavalkya Smriti, Yajnavalkya says, It is not our hermitage, he says. Still, less the color of our skin that produces virtue. Still less the color of our skin. It is not our hermitage or our color of skin. It is not our hermitage, still less the color of our skin that produces virtue. Virtue must be practiced. Therefore, let no one do to others what he would not have done to himself. And Yoga Vasishta says, practice righteousness, not unrighteousness. Speak truth, not untruth. Look far, not near. Look up towards the highest, not towards anything low. See, the whole refrain of the Vedas is be truthful to yourself. It is invoking the Sakshi, invoking your conscience, and Dharma is guided by the Sakshi. Says Manu. Here is what Manu says. Professor Max Muller refers to Manu. Manu has been deprecated, criticized, pulled down by none other than James Mill, who wrote the History of India, which was a reference book to the ICS trainees. So he refers to that and says, and the laws of the Manavas, that is Manus, which were so much abused by Mill, that is James Mill, what do they teach? What does Manusmriti says? He quotes, evildoers think indeed that no one sees them, but the gods see them, and the old man within, the self, the conscience, the Sakshi sees them. Self is the witness of the self. Self is the refuge of self. Do not despise thy own self, the highest witness of men, says Manu. And what is truth? Truth is nothing but who regulates the truth? Truth is regulated by the self, by the conscience. If, friend, thou thinkst thou art self alone, remember there is the silent thinker, the highest self always within thy heart, and he sees what is good and what is evil. In fact, Manu says dharma is, what is the basis of dharma? He says, Vedo kilo dharma moolam. Smriti shilecha tadvidam. Acharena tu sadhunam. Atmanas truptirevacha. Atmana tushtirevacha. It has to satisfy your conscience. So this reference to the conscience, which is the essence of truth, has been there right from the Vedas and insistently there. So it is the base of our culture, and that is why Indian society has been attempting to be truthful. And look at what Mahabharata says, the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. The Mahabharata says, let 1,000 horse sacrifices, Ashwamedha Yajna, Ashwamedha Yaga. Let 1,000 horse sacrifices and truth be weighed in the balance. The truth will weigh heavier. All the rituals would have meaning only if a person is truthful. That's what Mahabharata says. Now let us look at Ramayana. Ramayana, the central episode in Ramayana, as I see it, is the episode when Rama abdicates and goes to the forest. Not abdicating from Ayodhya and going to the forest. In fact, from Ayodhya, he goes to the forest. He leaves Ayodhya, rides on his chariot, And then 2 days later, 2 nights later, he was on the bank of Ganga. And after that, he crosses Ganga and goes to Bharadwaj ashram, from where he goes to Chitrakuta. In about a month's time, Bharata comes to know of the developments in Ayodhya, comes back to Ayodhya, sees that his father was dead, but he was not to accept the throne, and he goes to Chitrakuta to convince Sri Rama to come back. There are a lot of supplications and requests and pleadings by Bharata, but Sri Rama refuses. It is at that time a minister of Dasharatha by name Jabali, he was a Brahmin, he tries to intervene and advises Rama to accept this offer and return to Ayodhya. He gives all kinds of philosophical arguments. The philosophical argument which Jabali advances is the materialist ideology, the Charvaka philosophy. He says it in so many words that what is the meaning of relationship? What is the meaning? Your father is dead and gone. The kingdom is offered to you. Why don't you accept it? There is no point in hanging on to these values, which you call as values, and waste your life. That was the line which Jabali offers very strongly. It runs into several shlokas. And Sri Rama replies to that, but he rejects it. I'll take you to the original Valmiki Ramayana, where these verses are depicted. Because it is quite interesting. Professor Max Muller has given the translation as he saw it, but then it is good to see the original because Valmiki affords us a deeper insight. This is what Jabali says. Who is related to who? He says. Who is related to who? What is to be gained by this relationship? Every creature is born alone and dies alone. Kah kasya purusho bandhu. He says that who is related to who? What is the meaning of relationship? After all, he is dead and gone now. O Rama, he who clings to another, one who clings to another, saying, this is my father, this is my mother, indeed has lost his wits. There is none who belongs to another. He says, I pity those who, for the sake of dharma, abstain from sensual enjoyments. For they invite needless suffering in this life in the hope of a glorious future, but everything ends upon death. This is typically the Charvaka philosophy. Life is there from birth to death, beyond that, nothing. Says Jabali. Those people who say that the 8th day after death is devoted for propitiating the spirits of ancestors, see the waste of food. How can a dead man eat? He says that it is just a waste of food. Then Sri Rama rejects this outright. He says that, this is Sri Rama, that in your desire to please me, which you have counseled, though appearing to be noble, is indeed contrary. It is poison offered as edible food. He doesn't accept it. Then he goes on to condemn the argument. He says the eternal principle of governance is based on truth. Raja Vrittam Sanatanam, he says. A king cannot afford to abandon truth. The principle of governance itself is based on truth and not brute force. He cannot use the force without the support of dharma. Therefore, the essence of statehood is truth alone. Satyatmakam Rajyam. The order in the world rests from truth. The whole world is sustained by truth. Yes. Rama goes to the extent of saying that truth is God. Satyameveshwaro loke satye dharma samashritah. Satya mulani sarvani nasti satyan param padam. Truth is God and truth is the base of dharma. All virtues are rooted in truth. There is nothing higher than truth. In saying that, who has to monitor the truth? Your own conscience has to monitor the truth. Only a materialist who does not believe or does not have Shraddha in the conscience, in the spirit, he advocates the Charvaka philosophy. Rama rejects this, but then very, very beautifully he says, a cynical intellectual, typical Jabali, a cynical intellectual, he calls this Buddha. He compares him to a thief. He says, Yatha hi chora, sa tatha hi buddha. As he creates doubts in the mind of citizens and should be treated accordingly. In any case, a wise person should not consult with a cynical atheist. Having said this, Rama makes one more statement which is very important. Professor Max Muller doesn't quote that, but it's important. Valmiki says this through Sri Rama. Sri Rama makes an observation which is very, very insightful because he talks about paradigm. In these Jijnasa sessions, we have discussed paradigms, both the mechanistic paradigm and the spiritualistic paradigm. Sri Rama and Jabali represent two separate paradigms. Look at Rama's opinion. He says, I blame my father for taking you into service of the kingdom. He says, Nindamyaham karma pituhu. My father's action I blame. In accepting you and entrusting you with the administration, the responsibilities of administration, he says. You, a firm atheist with a confused intellect, fallen from the right path, should not have been employed. This puts the scare in Jabali's mind. See, the conviction of Jabali started shaking immediately. Immediately he recants and says, no, I am not uttering the words of an atheist. I am not an atheist, nor do I hold that the world is not. Sometimes I become a believer and some other time I may become an atheist again. Now that you are threatening to remove me from the position, if Sri Rama comes back, Jabali would lose his job. Then he says he withdraws from that. But the point I am trying to say is that is a conflict of paradigms. And in ancient India, even at the time of Ramayana, at the time of Sri Rama and Valmiki, it was very clear that the atheists are not fit for ruling. We need to remember this. We have adequate experience to formulate opinion on this. During the post-independent era, there are several atheists who held the helm of affairs, and India went on tangentially away from what should have been the righteous path for governance. Finally, I'll close with this statement of Max Muller. He says, I doubt whether any other of the ancient literatures of the world you will find traces of that extreme sensitiveness of conscience which despairs of our ever speaking the truth and which declares silence as gold and speech as silver, though in a much higher sense than our proverb. There is an English proverb which says, Silence is gold, speech is silver. He says that, yeah, English proverb says that, but in India, it is valued much higher. The truth, if you are not able to say the truth, be silent. But if you utter, you must utter the truth. That is the sensitiveness with which India has observed in its literature, in its scriptures. What I should wish to impress on those who will soon find themselves the rulers of millions of human beings in India, that is the ICS cadre. What I should wish to impress on these ICS cadre trainees is the duty to shake off national prejudices, which are apt to degenerate into a kind of madness. I have known people with brown skin whom I could look up to as my betters. That's it. So here we end the presentation on the book. If there are any questions or comments, I would be happy to hear them. Thank you. Any questions?
Hello.
Yes.
Sir, Max Muller never came to India?
He never came to India. Yes. In fact, Swami Vivekananda, when he met him in 1896, asked him to come to India.
Okay.
But he said, he shook his head. Vivekananda says, Swamiji says that he was almost on tears. And then Max Muller said, if I come there, I will not come back. You will have to cremate me there.
Oh.
Notice the word, cremate. He was a Christian. He doesn't talk about burial. He says cremate. I think by studying the scriptures, studying the Vedas, it has touched him in a right way. In fact, in our tradition, there is a saying that it is good to recite Vedas, good to hear the recital of Vedas. It would be good, it would be better, in fact, if you understand what that recital means. But even if you don't understand, it is good to listen to that. It will have a positive impact upon you. This is what our tradition says. Whereas Max Muller did not, probably his nuances and pronunciation may not have been the same as the Indian sages, but he studied the Vedas because he had to edit a huge corpus of literature. He studied the Vedas, which has touched him in the right manner. And that is why he developed that kind of a respect for India. Yeah, he never came to India. Yes. Anything else? Any other comments?
Yeah, very
Okay,
nice.
so
very nice lecture, sir. I enjoyed. Thank you.
yeah, welcome.
Sir, Ravish here. One question.
Yeah.
I guess the concept of Satya in this lecture is it's more towards truth, speaking truth.
Yeah.
But the concept of Satya is actually a little bit wider than that, isn't
Yes.
it? I mean, in the sense that,
Yes.
yeah, because see, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, there the concept of Satya is about Satya and Mithya as such, right? So Satya in itself has, it also kind of includes dharma portion in it because, I mean, when I say speaking truth is not the only.
That's right. Satya means existence.
Right.
Existence. The Upanishad says, Sadeva Soumya Idamagra Asit Ekameva Dvitiyam. the existence itself, Brahman as existence, is the one reality
Truth. Yeah.
under this universe. So the word actually derives its meaning from the word existence, which is never changing. It is always exists, it never changes in that sense. Even when we talk about the speech, the truthful speech, it derives the meaning from there. It is unchanging. What is the reality, what is the fact, and what you utter? They are connected by truth in the sense that you have to represent the reality as it is. As it is. And who is to monitor whether it is or not? It is yourself. Yourself. Just because the other man cannot come to know, does not know, cannot come to know, you have no authority to alter it. That is the meaning of verbal truth. So you have to utter as it has happened. You cannot say, you can alter it just because the other fellow may not know. In fact, you see in Ramayana, you see the exemplary nature of Rama's character comes from this. We have discussed one aspect of it in this encounter. There is another aspect that when Bharata comes and asks him to forgive and take back the kingdom, Sri Rama now says something else. Sri Rama says two reasons why he is not coming. The first reason he cites is that you do not know, and I too did not know. Sri Rama also did not know because this reference never occurs earlier. It occurs only at Chitrakuta when Bharata asks him to return. He says that Dasharatha at the time of marriage promised to Ashwapati Maharaja. Ashwapati is the father of Kaikeyi. That the son born out of Kaikeyi will be the ruler of Ayodhya. Dasharatha has made this promise. Says Rama to Bharata. That is the first reason. The second reason is that my father had given two boons to Kaikeyi and she has encashed on that and she asked for rulership for Bharata and forest life for Rama. This is the second reason. But the first reason occurs in Ramayana for the first time here only. At the time of preparation for coronation of Rama as Yuvaraja, it did not surface. It did not surface. But there is a subtle hint about that Dasharatha invites, all these things were prepared when Bharata was not in station. Bharata and Shatrughna had gone to Kekaya, which is far away from Ayodhya. It would take 7 to 14 days of travel. And Dasharatha comes to the court and announces in the court first, not in the house, in the court, that I am getting bad dreams. And when I consult the astrologers, they tell me that there is a danger for my life. Therefore, I would like to coronate Rama. And I want to do it tomorrow. Tomorrow is a auspicious time. And he takes the approval of the courtiers and then prepares coronation. And he sends for his nearby city dwellers and outside the city also, he sends people to come for the coronation. But he does not send for Kekaya. He says they will come to know on their own later. And then later he tells Rama, it is good that Bharata is not in station. He goes to that extent. But Rama obviously did not know at that time that there was a promise behind this by Dasharatha to Ashwapati. But a month later in Chitrakuta, Rama refers to this and Bharata did not know it. Bharata was asking for it, but then he says that this is a fact, I cannot violate it now. See, this is the meaning of truthfulness in terms of speech. It is his conscience that guides him. And this is a model kept before the Indian society for the last at least 7,000 years. And when Max Muller notices this in such a beautiful manner, that the society has actually lived up to it. There's a truth and justice are the hallmarks of the Indian society. And this has really touched Max Muller. This would touch anybody. Yeah. So any other comments?
Thank you, sir. And one another question, I think, in this where you quote the Sanskrit slokas from Ramayana and their meaning, can you give the reference for that as well?
Yeah.
Like a good reference to.
Yeah, it is given in the, see, you're talking about these shlokas. These are from the book, which some of them I have picked from the book and some, of course, I have added. But then all are referenced. You look at the PPT, you will get the reference.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
All of them are referenced.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just out of interest in this discussion took time, a thought came to me. So
Yeah.
in Ramayana, you said, okay, Rama is truthful, always spoke truth.
Yeah.
And in Mahabharata, Krishna,
Yeah.
can we say that he always spoke truth, or is there any contrary to that? Did he speak always truth, or
Where do you find that he spoke untruth?
can we say that? So same statement to him also?
Yeah, I can say that.
Okay, but
Where do you
his truth
find
and
very
Rama's
untruth?
truth were different. There are some
There is a
differences.
difference. See, there is a difference. See, the society's general, what you say, the cultural milieu had changed from Ramayana to Mahabharata.
Okay, circumstances.
Ramayana was a very simplistic, truthful, cultural milieu.
Yeah.
So Valmiki describes the people of Ayodhya as Maharshaya Ivamala. He says that they are pure Maharshis. Whereas in Mahabharata, you are dealing with Duryodhana, you are dealing with Shakuni, you are dealing with Dhritarashtra, who hatch plans, who feed you with poison, who feed the Pandavas, you mean the Pandavas, who seek to burn them in Varanavata, who play dice deceitfully, who disrobe Draupadi. See, this cannot happen unless the society surrounding Duryodhana was also in a way accepting it, right? Including Bhishma and Drona.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was happening. So the culture milieu was not the same. I know why you have asked this question. Because there is an episode in Mahabharata
Yeah.
where Krishna became a Sarathi.
Yes.
He did not wield the weapons.
Yes.
Yeah. Krishna came alone, not alone, along with his friend Satyaki, he came to the Pandava side. During the 13 years of the Vanavas, the Pandavas were in the forest. They had no political activity. They had no time or connections. I should not say time. They did not have the connections to develop political alliances. And in the last 1 year, they had to live incognito. They cannot undertake any open activity.
Yeah.
And Duryodhana did it all with cunning. Duryodhana and Shakuni. So that they will not be able to do it. When they come out of the Ajnatavasa, they don't have any connections at all. So if you look at the war arraignment, you find only Drupada and Virata standing on the side of Pandavas. The major armies were from these two kingdoms. Both were related to the Pandavas directly by marriage. One is Draupadi's father and brother. Another is Abhimanyu's father-in-law and brother-in-law.
Okay.
Abhimanyu was married just before the war.
Yeah.
That was a political alliance.
Yeah.
And from the Yadavas, including the Yadavas, they had split. Yadavas entirely, almost entirely, did not listen to Krishna. Balarama was their chieftain. Krishna was their counselor, but they did not listen to Krishna. They listened to Balarama, and they decided to go on the side of the Duryodhana. Entirely, lock, stock, and barrel, barring two warriors. One was Krishna, another was Satyaki. But Krishna decided not to fight, not to wield weapons. Not fight means not wield weapons. He said, I'll become a Sarathi. But he violated that in the middle of the war. Probably that's what you're hinting at. But for this, there is nothing else. Yeah. But then Krishna remained a Sarathi only.
Yeah.
The point is that he demonstrated that he is ready to do anything. The word will not catch him there. It will not prevent him.
Yeah. So
Ready-
what I was saying is, sir, he was like a neutral person.
He was not a neutral person. No, he was not neutral. He
Mean,
was on the side of
he was
Pandavas.
not active. He was not actively engaged, but the brain behind the fight was him. Yeah, but
Correct.
he
Correct.
used
He was not
to.
neutral.
He
He was not neutral. Not only that, he declares that he will win this war, even if Arjuna doesn't fight.
Okay.
This he says in the Gita. Dronancha Bhishmancha Jayadratancha Karnan Tatha Anya Api Yoda Viran Mayai Vaite Nihata Purvameva. I have decided to remove them. Rite Pitwan Na Bhavishyanti Sarve Evastita Pratyanikeshu Yodha. Even if you don't fight Arjuna, none of these people are going home. Krishna says this. If you don't want, you don't fight. And then he wields the weapon and jumps from the chariot and goes towards Bhishma. This happens 2 days after that. But that is because Arjuna doesn't fight fully in a full vigor. He tells Satyaki that this man is not fighting. Because of his respect for Bhishma, he is not fighting, he says. Therefore, I shall wield the weapon, he says. Tasmat aham grihya rathanga mugram pranam harishyami mahavratasya. So this is the only place where you see that, but then it's a vibrant demonstration of his commitment to dharma, and he is not bound by any finite, any limited this thing, because he has to establish dharma. There is nowhere else you will find Krishna telling a lie. In fact, in the middle of the war, it comes in this article also. Professor Max Muller also has quoted this. There is a Brahmin by name Kaushika who is, devoted to truth in speech, and he was doing tapasya. And in front of his ashrama one day, a traveler keeps coming, and he takes to a fork and runs in one path. Then a few robbers come after him. They ask this man whether there was a traveler here. He said yes. He has to be truthful. He said yes. He said, which way has he gone? So he showed him the path. So these people went and waylaid him, and the poor fellow died. Krishna tells this story and says, this man, though he was truthful in speech, he was not really truthful in dharma.
Okay.
He says that you have to be discriminative on that. What is the ultimate good? That you have to be very clear.
Yeah, that's what I was coming to. So, more than truth, dharma presides.
Yes, in that sense, yes. But then at one level, the truth and dharma are one and the same. The definition.
So there can be some level of compromise can be done for the truth to achieve dharma.
If you are dispassionate and dharma is your only purpose, then that becomes truth also. The purpose of truth is dharma only.
In some cases, that we may have to deviate from the truth to achieve dharma.
Now, if
Is
you-
that okay?
Please repeat what you said. We may have to deviate from truth
Truth
to achieve
in
dharma.
some cases
Yeah.
to
If you-
achieve dharma.
Yeah. If you are clear on your dharma, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
See,
Dharma
says-
can we say in a present, like can we say intention also to equate it to dharma?
It is not as simple as that. If your conscience says that, that is it.
Okay.
If your
Conscious.
conscience says that, that is it. See, the definition of dharma is Vedo kilo dharma moolam. The Vedas have stated it in at various levels. Great descriptions given. Smriti shile cha tadvidam. People of by learned sages, smritis have been formed. Smriti is like Yajnavalkya Smriti, Devala Smriti, Manu Smriti, etc. Acharaschaiva sadhuna. Apart from this, because these are descriptions, documentations, but they don't cover all kinds of situations.
Okay.
Because the variety is the order of nature.
Yeah.
No two situations are alike, no two individuals are alike, no two, the same individual in two different contexts are alike.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
there is always a dynamic factor which has to make a decision.
Yes.
Including the fact that there are situations which are very much akin, like acharaschaiva sadhuna, the learned sages, how they behaved in a particular context, that is your model. But still, no two situations are alike, and therefore there is an element where you have to use your discretion.
Okay.
And there, atmanas tushtirevacha. Your guide is your conscience.
Consciousness. Yeah.
So if your conscience says that, you do it.
Okay.
In that case, the untruth becomes truth. Krishna says this very explicitly to Arjuna. Very, very explicitly. There are some 35 shlokas in which Krishna tells him what is the dharma sukshma. He says
Exactly.
all values derive their sanctity from dharma. All values.
Yeah.
Like the truth, like ahimsa.
Yes.
See, what is himsa, no? Ahimsa is a great value, he says. Yes. Ahimsa is a great value. In fact, in the Sadgunas which he lists in Gita, ahimsa is one of them. Ahimsa satyam akrodha. But he says, himsa, violence for the sake of establishing a larger ahimsa, that is dharmic himsa, is dharma. It is superior to this. If you are not using your discrimination and using it as Jawaharlal Nehru did in the case of a Chinese invasion or in Kashmir, the ahimsa will yield a bloody mess. So he says ahimsa for establishing ahimsa is the real ahimsa.
Yes.
Likewise, the untruth, he says, untruth for the sake of establishing truth is the real truth, he says.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Clear, sir. Very clear.
So he gives the story. This is Krishna's story to Arjuna. This Kaushika, who told a truth, but actually ended up in the murder of the man, for which he cannot disown responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to save somebody by telling a lie, you can tell lie. Please do.
Okay.
But then don't use it casually. And
Hmm.
don't try to justify to your own conscience, oh, it is okay. Krishna also has said this.
Contextual.
It is contextual and it should be guided by your conscience.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. A dispassionate judgment it should be.
Hmm.
Masakshi, we say.
Hmm.
See, the whole of spiritual practice in one angle, one side, one aspect of that is developing your conscience. It will
Developing
be
your
conscience.
conscious. Okay.
Yeah. The Sakshi. At one end,
Yeah.
it is that. It may be, you can have different interpretations of that, like your chakras start glowing, the Kundalini, Jagrita, and all that. That is one side. But in another side, I'm saying that it is rousing your own conscience. Conscience is there for everybody, but then it may be weak, it may be strong. You have to
Yeah.
strengthen that.
Okay.
So if there is a context where it is required, then you should be able to look to yourself and say, I did it right.
Yeah. Correct. Got it, sir. Very clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah.
Any
anything
other
else?
questions are there? Yeah.
Okay.
All right, sir.
Yeah, so we'll sing Shanti Mantra.
Yeah.
Yeah. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramantu Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukkham Om
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Bye. Bye.
Oh.